All right, Tim. I smell a VRAM question, so
Okay.
let's get into it. Black Myth Wukong, a game I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. The benchmarks seem to be crushing GPUs without going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Do we know this is due to developer optimization, engine optimization, or tech like direct storage being utilized? Has the VRAM apocalypse been postponed?
Right. So I think when it comes to Black Myth Wukong, there's a very simple explanation for why the game doesn't use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM in some configuration. It can use more than 8 gigabytes if you enable the usual VRAM taxing settings, so like your frame generation, ray tracing. Mm-hmm. Those at 1440p and 4K will push you over 8 gigabytes. You probably need a 12 gig GPU for that. But the simple reason with this game is that the texture quality isn't that good. That's just the simple reality of that game. A lot of the focus on the visuals has been the lighting system, so the use of Unreal Engine Lumen and also path tracing, and the world density, so the amount of trees and things that you see in the game world is quite high.
Which is, I think that's the most impressive part about the game.
Yeah,
well,
that makes the game look really realistic and lifelike. But then if you look closely at some of the textures used in the game, it's just not that impressive. There wouldn't be what I would describe as high resolution textures, and you'll see that across some of the trees, the rocks, general surfaces, and it's really noticeable in areas where the lighting system or the density of the game world isn't there. So there are sections where, there's no light sources creating those, nice shadows and global illumination effects. It's just a general scene, and then you look at a rock and you're like, okay, yeah, it makes sense why this uses less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So
I always find that one of the most disappointing aspects of a game as well, because a game like that will suck you in. Like, initially you get in the level of detail and the environment's like a bit breathtaking, like, wow, this is amazing. And it invites you to have a closer look because you're so taken back by how it looks. And then you'll want to take a closer look and start really inspecting the environment. And you walk up to a rock and you're like, oh, okay, I am playing a video game. That's that kind of spoils it. And again, that's something that we've wanted to see in games is better texture quality. But at the same time, we can't really hammer the developer about that too much because most people have 8 gigabytes of VRAM still, which is why we've been advocating for mainstream GPUs for ages now to have more VRAM, and really they should. There's no reason why they can't, apart from money.
I mean, to be fair, with a game like Black Myth, there are settings that you can't run on mainstream GPUs anyway, like path tracing. So I would have thought that
that's what I was going to get
VRAM,
to.
A high VRAM setting makes sense in the same vein. It's like, people with 8 gig GPUs can't run that, but 8 gig GPUs can't run path tracing anyway. So it's kind of like provide those sort of settings. But then again, it is the developer's first game, so how many resources they wanted to dump into it.
Probably more resources go into creating higher textures than they do adding ray traced effects, would be my guess.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variety to the scenery and stuff in the game. There's many different biomes and things, so each chapter is a different environment design. That's why the game is like 120 gig. And so if you're thinking about, we can implement path tracing across the game, maybe that's one setting, or change all the textures. You can see why they'd make that call.
That's right. And even then, that would have to be, like you see in games like Far Cry 6, an HD texture pack.
Yeah.
Because it would make the base game so massive. And if a lot of people are only, have 8 gigabyte cards, for example, and are only using medium quality textures, they're downloading a significant portion of the game that's just not relevant to them. So, there's all these sort of reasons for why. But it would be nice to be able to take advantage of all these graphics cards now that we're seeing with 12, 16, and larger VRAM buffers. But other games we've talked about in the past, Cyberpunk, that's often lauded for being such a great-looking game. And it is a good-looking game, but again, the texture quality in Cyberpunk isn't great. It's pretty flat, pretty bland in a lot of ways. And if you look back through time, the games that I think have aged really well, like, people keep saying, back in the day, games looked better than they do now, which isn't true. But there are games that have aged really well, and it's almost universally because they used really high quality, at the time they were photorealism textures.
Combined with the material quality so that lighting is bouncing off them
Sure.
realistically.
Yep.
And that can often be, I think of a game like when I was playing Dead Space last year, whenever it came out, the remake, and you'll see on those surfaces, there's sometimes like multiple textures where there might be like a metal pole with some blood splattered on it, and the reflections on the metal versus the blood are different. Whereas if you use more basic textures and more basic materials on the surfaces, you don't get that interaction, so it doesn't look as good.
Yep.
And I think, games like Black Myth suffer from not having as much of that in them. And I'm yet to sort of see a game where the texture quality is really good, but also the game runs with less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It's not that common, especially for like the best, most impressive texture quality settings. And even today, when we're talking about games like Black Myth, they still will not run on an 8 gig GPU with all the bells and whistles enabled.
Yep.
And that's the case with a lot of those other games that we've tested over the years, where you turn on ray tracing or frame generation or both, and it takes an 8 gigabyte game to running over 8 gig.
Yeah.
So it's
almost a chicken and egg situation, though I think the hardware does have to lead. And I do believe if we had 16 gigabyte GPUs as the mainstream offerings at this point in time, which we certainly could, 7600 XTs exist and whatnot, the games would look better. They would have higher quality textures, which is why we keep pushing for you guys. This is misunderstood a lot. We're not saying don't be poor, buy an RTX 4080 or whatever, get more VRAM. That is absolutely not what we've ever said or claimed. It's not, this guidance isn't necessarily targeted at you. It'd be good to buy, a 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti over the 8 gigabyte model. If you have to buy that GPU for whatever reason, then get the 16 gigabyte model. But these VRAM specific videos are targeted at AMD and Nvidia. And I guess we're trying to educate the audience to demand more VRAM rather than just having 8 gigabytes crammed down your throat for the next 5 years, because that's all you need. But as for the VRAM apocalypse as well, I mean, there's so many examples. I've got a couple here, we've seen Doom Eternal, Resident Evil 4, the Callisto Protocol if you want to enable ray tracing. Horizon Forbidden West is a gorgeous looking game that huge difference between a RTX 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB at highly playable frame rates. So that's a game where you really do want at least 12GB of VRAM if you want to use the very high preset, and especially dabble with technologies like frame generation. The Last of Us Part 1, obviously, classic one there. Ratchet and Clank, that's a really good example. That's another good looking game that likes a lot of VRAM. And then there are other games that have flown under the radar that have a lot of VRAM related problems, but they're not necessarily frame stuttering problems. They're more image quality problems. And they're like Halo Infinite and Forspoken, for example. So there's plenty of games that you can point to already. It's not really, I don't think the 8GB thing hasn't been a future problem for a long time. It's a here and now problem. And it's a complex one. I could really talk about this from so many different angles for an hour or so, because it is a subject that people seem to take the wrong way. Because, you can just lower texture quality settings and voila, it's problem solved. And I think for those of you with more affordable, like what you say, $300 GPUs or less, then that's a perfectly acceptable thing. But when you're being sold $400, $500 US graphics cards that support technologies like ray tracing, that's a key selling point of that product. Get it because it has ray tracing, get it because it supports frame generation. And we're seeing more and more of these key technologies require more and more VRAM. And when you can't use those technologies because you don't have enough VRAM, that's a problem. So that's why we're advocating for those middle of the road and up products to have really a minimum of 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And we're advocating that on behalf of gamers, not telling gamers to spend more money. So anyway, there's a lot more to it, but that's the quick and dirty summary. So we'll move on